Good evening. Good evening, and thank you for being here. But most of all, Sasha, thank you. You've been an inspiration for many in your generation, and more importantly, you've saved a lot of additional lives of refugees through Refuge Point. So we at Harvard were delighted to present to you the Gleitzman Award a couple of years ago, which recognizes the leading humanitarians in the world. One award a year, $125,000. And Sasha won that a couple of years ago by unanimous choice of the judges. So thank you and congratulations. And this was, of course, an inspiring film. Now, we really can't see, but your dad is out here somewhere, and you and he co-authored this wonderful book. So if you could recognize him, and if you can see any better than I can, and anyone else you'd like to before we start, please.
Thank you, David. Thanks, and thanks everybody. Dad, are you there? Can you stand up? So my dad, David, I would say, is kind of the intellectual architect of this book. It's taken us many years, and we've done it, and I think his vision helped this to come to fruition. I also want to recognize this production is done by Show of Force, which is a company that is producing a global campaign and documentary on the refugee crisis called Humanity on the Move. They've previously done Half the Sky and A Path Appears, so you may have heard of their work before.
That's with Nick Kristof.
That's with Nick Kristof, and
his
he's
wife.
engaged with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I also want to recognize Mammy Najurama, whom you saw in the video here, who has flown in from Phoenix, Arizona. Mammy, thank you for being
Where's
here.
Mammy? Where is she?
There she is.
She was one of the 32?
She was one of the 32. She was 15 years old and cared for her family in the most desperate circumstances. I also just want to recognize briefly my mom, Sasha Chanoff, who's my hero. There's my mom. And Jessica Hussein, Refuge Point's board chair, Charles Bronfman, who's a great friend and ally, Eddie Stern, and so many other inspiring people who are here tonight. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Now let's talk about the book some. There are books out here on the outside the hall, and I urge each and every one of you, if you can. This is a wonderful read. But give us a sense the overall arc of the book and the steps that you have seen about developing one's moral center, especially during a crucible time.
So obviously this for me was a life-changing experience. And while this situation was unique, I think everybody at one point or another will be faced with decisions that impact others in some significant way. Mm-hmm. So this book takes a unique story and then makes it general, makes it applicable and available to all of us because it highlights principles that we need to think about when we confront decisions. Those 5 principles are to be prepared for the fact that we will face decisions that will impact others. And if we're prepared, then we need to open our eyes to those decisions. For me, opening my eyes was going into that tent. And after that, another principle is to confront yourself. Argue with yourself or have somebody argue with you. For me, Sheikha was the person who helped me confront myself, helped me to understand what was at my core. Mm-hmm. And when you confront yourself, you need to then know yourself. That's the 4th principle. But even with all these things, I think it is often very hard to make a decision when there are a lot of factors at play. So the 5th principle is to take courage, to do what you have determined is the right thing for you to do.
Both physical and moral courage.
I think clearly, for me, this was something where we felt that we were putting ourselves at more risk.
You did. You thought you might be killed too?
No, Congo was at war. We needed armed guards to do this. So Sheikha and I did feel in danger there, and we knew that trying to take them would increase that danger.
Right. And crucibles, other scholars of leadership have often talked about the importance of crucibles in people's lives. And a couple of examples that come to me, and I'd like to ask you about other examples that occur to you. Gandhi when he was in South Africa. He went there as a barrister, you'll remember. And there was a memorable time when he was on a train as an Indian living in South Africa, and the whites who controlled the train threw him off and embarrassed him, humiliated him. And that's when he decided to become an activist in South Africa. And that activism then drew him back to India. He was called back to India to organize a resistance and to throw off the yoke of colonialism. But it was that moment, that crucible moment, that clarified things for him. For Martin Luther King, it was very much, he wanted to be a preacher, not a man in the streets. But he found, once Birmingham started to unfold and Rosa Parks, the whole episode there, he had no choice but to leave the pulpit. He kept preaching to people, you've got to stand up, you've got to stand up. He had to get into the streets with them. That was his moral decision. It was something he did not want to do, but he did. So I'm just curious, are there other examples that you have found in your own experiences, or have you found in history, that help to illustrate this point about those crucibles and how you have to make the tough decision that you made?
I think so. I mean, the points, the things that I think about are decision points that, again, influence people's lives, as you said. I mean, Nelson Mandela, of course, comes to mind as somebody who had to make a decision about forgiveness, a very internal decision, but making that decision, I think, helped to influence a whole nation. In the book, we bring in stories of a number of 8 other leaders, from the military to the health profession to humanitarians, who faced their own crucible moments. Muhammad Abdi is a humanitarian who faced a kind of not dissimilar situation to the one I faced. But Eric Greitens, a friend of ours who started the Mission Continues, also faced a crucible moment where he had to think about his experience as a Navy SEAL and what he wanted to do with that, confronting other wounded veterans, and that led him to starting an organization.
And Sasha, what conclusions have you drawn about how, having gone through the crucible, how you were affected, how it changed your life?
I mean, what it did for me was to open my eyes to other people who had faced violence and who were refugees, who were off the radar. So I'm not sure I would have acted or behaved like this before that experience, but after, everywhere I went, I saw situation after situation with people who were off the radar. For example, when I worked in Kakuma camp with the Sudanese Lost Boys, who were resettling to the US through our government's program, I saw that there were many hundreds of girls who faced the exact same circumstances as those young men. They too had fled violence in South Sudan.
I was never clear why there was the Lost Boys and not the Lost Girls.
And there is a very bad reason. The fact is that they were overlooked.
The girls.
The girls. When girls hit the age of 13 or 14, they become marriage age, and then the people who were looking over them wanted to sell them, force them into marriage against their will for a bride price. And so they were kept at home. They were not allowed to go out of their homes in the refugee camp, and from there they were sold into marriage against their will. So they were off the radar.
Okay. I know that we're going to be opening this up to your questions, and you may have cards. I think you should have cards if you want to send a question up. But I inevitably, I think with so many things happening in the world, from the migrant crisis to Orlando, I'd like to talk about society's response to these crucible moments in the life of society. You formed Refuge, you organized Refuge Point. You've served a large number of people, thousands, tens upon tens of thousands of people that you've helped to save. And yet, as you yourself have argued in the book and argue elsewhere, but how many people are there migrants in the world now? 60 million people?
Who've been forcibly displaced more than at any time since World War II, over 60 million.
Over 60 million.
Yep.
And one of the things that's been striking that I've heard you talk about is once they become refugees, it, on average, takes a long, long time to go home.
The average amount of time, right, as you say, it's nearing 20 years. Some
20 years.
Are refugees for generations. In Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya, the largest in the world, there are over 10,000 people whose grandparents arrived there 25 years ago as refugees.
You're kidding.
No. So we are facing a new time, and I think a different kind of crisis than perhaps previously. So
I accept that, but and tell me, how do we, as a world, sort of reason our way through this? Yeah, we've looked upon Europe for a long time as a very civilized place. And Angela Merkel made, for example, a courageous decision to have the migrants come to Germany. But now there's an uprising against her, a political uprising against her, from people who feel they're losing their way and that they're losing their country. You know, there's a vote coming up in Britain in the next couple of weeks about whether Britain should stay or leave the European Union, the so-called Brexit vote. And it's been well argued that if you're British and you think about Brexit in terms of economics, it's wiser to stay in the union. But what's driving them toward exit, and right now the polls have leaving 5 or 10 points ahead, what's driving them toward the exit is refugees. And how the immigration issue that is the number of immigrants who've come from within the EU and have changed the nature of their society. So help us sort this out. Mm-hmm. What is the world's responsibility here?
We clearly have a responsibility, but we have to shift how we engage and think about refugees. I think since World War II, the traditional response has been, when people flee a country, give them tents and food and wait till they go home.
Yes.
And that's often worked. People want to do nothing more than go home. But now people don't go home. We have to, Alex Alenikov, UNHCR's recent Deputy High Commissioner, said, we have to think of a fourth Newtonian law of motion. And the fourth one he proposed is that people who are on the move will stay on the move. So we have to readjust ourselves to that. And we can't think about refugees as people who are just in need of a handout. We have to think of them as people with assets who can contribute. When Mammy, who's here tonight, who was 15 years old and faced the worst situation in the world with her family, where she saw many people around her die, she came to the U.S. She's now a U.S. citizen. Her husband is here with her tonight. They have a family. She works at a foundation helping other people. Time after time, I have seen that people who come here contribute. They become part of the fabric of our society and our community, and they go on to inspire us. I mean, you know Deng Chol.
Yes,
so
yes, one of the lost boys of Sudan. Yeah, he came to the county school. We hope he's going to become president of South Sudan at one point. And he's a wonderful human being.
So we have to shift our thinking to engage with people who've been forcibly displaced as people who can contribute to our societies, who can bring resources and abilities. And we see, so 2 years ago, $25 billion was spent on humanitarian aid, and it wasn't nearly enough. Last year, we saw that Syrians started trying to get into Europe after the World Food Program said to about 800,000 people, sorry, we've run out of food. We can't support you anymore. So many Syrians and others faced the fact that they would watch their children starve, and the children had no access to education or other ways to support themselves. Right. So they were forced into the arms of traffickers, risking their lives because they had no other choice.
So where should they, I have two issues. One is, where can they productively go, that they're welcomed? I mean, and secondly, what do we do about these people getting on these ships and drowning? It's unbelievable to me how people are drowning and nobody is out there. We don't have naval ships from countries around Europe and the U.S. trying to escort those people or get them there safely. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
And and by the way, nobody seems to care all that much.
No, I think there is this, we've seen before, a kind of humanitarian fatigue, which we cannot let ourselves fall into. We have to recognize first that even more people from the African continent have tried to cross the Mediterranean and have lost their lives from the Middle East. We have to recognize that this is a symptom of a broader problem. The problem is that people have no pathway to any kind of productive lives in the countries to which they fled. This is finally a problem that's being recognized at the highest levels. Now refugees and forcibly displaced are now included in the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals.
The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals.
Exactly. So with the Millennium Development Goals, which just ended, refugees were not included in that. Mm-hmm. The fact that refugees are now included in that means that there's a framework for the international community to think about a response that is based in development and not just in emergency aid. If we can look in Kenya, in Jordan, even in many other countries, for ways that refugees can have some opportunity for self-reliance, and that's happening. They're actually pilot projects.
But a place like Jordan is absolutely overwhelmed now.
Yes.
But how, and other countries would say, wow, we don't want to go the way of Jordan.
The World Bank is actually contributing a very significant amount of money to Jordan in order to help Jordanians to establish themselves, to help Jordan increase its development opportunities, and part of that is looking at the refugee issue in Jordan. Certainly, it's an extreme example because Jordan is so overfull.
So, can you point to one or two examples of countries or communities that have handled this extremely well?
Yeah. Tanzania welcomed refugees from World War II, allowed them to become citizens.
These were Europeans?
Europeans. There are now some Europeans who have helped, who are citizens of Tanzania. That is a model country. They have actually just recently enabled about 200,000 refugees living in Tanzania to become citizens of the country. Of course, that's not going to happen everywhere, but I think if we can switch our frame to understand that refugees are people who can contribute, who can be assets, and we enable them to use those assets to support themselves and contribute to their communities, then we can start to change how people think about them.
And what is your argument toward those who are citizens of countries who say, listen, we have a very high unemployment rate here. Our young people in Europe, the unemployment rates among young people are very, very high. Mm-hmm. They go to university, they can't get jobs. And you're going to open the floodgates to a lot of refugees who are going to take potential jobs that they could take. Don't you also have a responsibility to your own citizens? And how do you balance that off? How do you balance off the obligations of the state in a democracy where people are saying no more or let's slow this down? Mm-hmm. How do you balance that? It just seems to me it's a very hard one to deal with. It's
a great question. But the fact is that we have seen here in the U.S. statistically that refugees do not take jobs from Americans, that they are actually people often who, because of the extreme circumstances they've gone through, they are innovators. We've seen that many refugees, from Bosnians to Somalis, Bosnians in St. Louis, Somalis in Lewiston, Maine, have actually helped to regenerate areas of our country that have been depressed through business development. And we've seen that they've started their own businesses and then helped to rebuild communities that have not flourished well.
Is it the condition of a particular community that is welcoming? Is it the economic opportunities in that community? What is it that suggests that one community is a better place to settle refugees? And how many numbers? Do you reach a tipping point when you start bringing in refugees so that it goes from being very productive to having so many people feel overwhelmed and the society, the local economy is overwhelmed?
Certainly here in the U.S., well over 1 million immigrants come every year. Our refugee program brings in this year 70,000, next year 85,000, and then the next year 100,000. So it's a small percentage of those that we encourage to come here. In our largest year, in 1981, over 200,000 refugees came here. They were able to integrate. So we are not close to any kind of tipping point here. I think Europe is a different example with people trying to get in there. I think what we see is that we need to first find more ways for people to support themselves in the countries to which they fled, and we also have to find more migration opportunities, legitimate, rationalized migration opportunities, so people can be safe and go to other countries.
You know, there is a fear that the refugee crisis, if the numbers continue to go the way they have in the last 2 years, they could destabilize Europe. And the Brexit vote, by my way of thinking, would be a huge setback for the British. Mm-hmm. And it's being driven, as I say, by this immigration issue. And so I think this problem is going to get more serious before it gets better. Because the numbers are so unbelievable and the plight of people is so awful.
Not only that, but I think when you look historically, you see that in times of drought and famine, forced migration increases.
That's a good point.
So if we look towards the future—
Climate change, yep.
I think we are maybe terribly and in a very scary way at the tip of the iceberg of what might be much more extreme displacement. So we're going to have to find ways to manage that. And I think those ways are both, as I said, through self-reliance opportunities in countries to which people have fled, as well as looking for more pathways for people to integrate.
Would you say that in the Syrian or the Middle East situation, that Mrs. Clinton has been talking occasionally about the need for safe havens, places that the Allied forces could clear the area and then basically provide protections from Assad going out and bombing. So there are no strike zones, and that if it would be better to have them stay there than to go on to Eastern or Western Europe.
I think that's certainly something to explore. I mean, we are seeing that protection of civilians in war and crisis situations is perhaps at its lowest with bombings of hospitals, right. MSF hospitals, right. And in other situations. So if we can have protected zones where people can reestablish themselves, that's certainly one area that we should explore.
Yeah, but there are some people in a sort of a safe zone who are on the border between Syria and Jordan Jordan doesn't want to let them in.
Yep.
And they're just sitting there.
Yes, and that is
a very, very vulnerable situation.
UNICEF is on the ground there among other agencies in those kinds of situations, and it is very vulnerable because they can't return home, and Jordan is not opening its...
Jordan says we got too many.
Jordan's saying that this is actually refugee resettlement, one of the areas that our organization works on, has been used not just to save people's lives, like this rescue operation, but also as a kind of international lever where in Tanzania, for example, the U.S. said, let us resettle some refugees here, and those that can't go home and will still be here, you give them opportunities for citizenship. Mm-hmm. So we also saw in Egypt, after the Libya civil war, that many people started fleeing into Egypt. Egypt wanted to close its border. The U.S. said, we'll start bringing in more refugees from who are fleeing from Libya to Egypt, and Egypt, you keep your borders open. So resettlement has actually been used not just to protect people's lives who are here in the audience, many former refugees who've been resettled, but as a kind of humanitarian protection for others, because it helps enable countries to keep their gates open for people who are fleeing conflict.
One of the issues that is very sensitive, of course, is the fear in Western Europe, the fear that's in the United States now about letting people in whose backgrounds you cannot check, who happen to be Muslim. And we all know that, the vast majority of people in the Muslim community, are decent, good people that can be very productive in your society. But there is this fear. Mm-hmm. Because unlike the refugees in some parts of the world, you cannot run a background check because someone coming out of Syria. There's just no. For all the different kind of questions you can ask, there's no way to verify anything they're saying. Mm-hmm. There are no databases, there's nothing to draw on. You can't draw upon, the normal, reaching out and asking acquaintances, friends, whatever, employers, that question. Is that is the fear legitimate, and how does one deal with it in terms of nation states?
My sense is that fear is not legitimate, that refugees have been wrongly conflated with the idea of terrorism. They are actually the first people who've been victims of terror. Yeah. I think also in the U.S., we're fortunate in a sense, geographically, that we have the ability to bring people in as we want in a rational way. The people who come to America as refugees are handpicked. It's far less than 1% of the global refugee population, and these people are handpicked by people like me who used to do this work, and now I run an organization working with the U.S. government to do this.
Is that true of people coming in?
They are handpicked. We know them, often for years before they actually have access to our resettlement program. So we do have the most thorough security checks for refugees in terms of any population coming to the U.S. You're right, you cannot check everybody all the time in the most in-depth way, but there are more checks on refugees than anybody else. That's why it takes an average of 2 to 3 years for Syrians to come here. But we also, I know, and what I've seen is that we hand-pick them. They are in a refugee camp. We get to know them as humanitarians. We visit them in their homes, and only after we feel certain that they are people who fled persecution and are in need of safety as a life-saving solution do we then initiate that resettlement process.
Are you using a legal term to describe refugees? What percentage of the people who come here who've been in these war-torn places like Syria are refugees versus others?
Yeah, so these are refugees. They have crossed an international boundary. They've been recognized by the UN Refugee Agency in the country to which they fled as refugees. They're registered in those countries as refugees.
Right.
And then
what about others? Are they? But that's not 100% of the people who come.
No. So every country has an asylum program, including ours, where people who can get into our country can then apply for asylum. And if they can articulate a well-founded fear of persecution, they'll go through a legal process and receive asylum here and have a pathway to.
And so if somebody, you would draw the line, I take it, if somebody went from the United States to Syria and then for unexplained reasons came back 6 months later or tried to, would you have some questions about that?
No, absolutely. I think we have to do everything in our power to make sure that we are safe and that we're securing ourselves. I think refugee issues are not the right place to look in terms of threats to our security.
Okay, so let's turn to Orlando then. How does that work out in your head?
You know, I think what we're seeing right now with ISIS, to me, strikes me as the most naked face of evil that we have seen at any time since perhaps World War II. I think because, you know, certainly we've had grand masters of evil with Stalin and Pol Pot and many others, but I think during World War II, it impacted all of us. And I think we're feeling that today again with the threat of ISIS, that it impacts everybody. So we have to make sure that we are protecting ourselves, but we have to act with compassion and empathy for people who are also victims of this terror and not turn our backs towards them in fear. You know, one of the
Which people who are victims?
Well, refugees who are the first victims, I think, of terror. So we can't associate or conflate people who are refugees with people who are terrorists. So we have to protect ourselves, but we have to act with compassion and empathy. And just to pivot to the book for a moment, you know, we talk about how there are many different things that influence our actions and decision. Fear is certainly one of them, but there are many other forces on us that lead us away from our center of compassion and empathy. But what we find in this book is that your center of compassion and empathy is actually core to who we are as human beings.
Right. How are you proud of the way the United States is handling the refugee crisis? I'm very aware that just north of us, the Trudeau government, the new Trudeau government, has really opened the doors and welcomed. And we have said, yes, we would like more, but not very much has happened.
Yeah. I was part of the 1998 Kosovo airlifts, where the U.S. airlifted Kosovars into our country because they had fled to the Macedonian border and were stuck there and in danger. We can do a lot better. I think we have always been a moral leader in terms of our approach to refugees and in terms of what we do in the world. I think we have to streamline our resettlement program. I think we have to make sure that our leaders are acting in accordance with our moral values. I think that helps to kind of define who we are as a nation right now. So we need to do more, but I think we are doing something. And
how would you respond to Mr. Trump's call for today? He didn't say let's ban all Muslims. He said we need a program that is tougher and asks tougher questions of people coming from countries where there is a lot of terrorism and anti-Western, anti-U.S. sentiment.
I don't think
this was aimed at Muslims coming from those countries.
Yeah. Refugees coming from these countries undergo multiple interviews from multiple people who are trained, from 3 to 5 people who are trained extensively to interview refugees. So they're handpicked, number one.
They're handpicked by the refugee organizations?
They're handpicked by the UN Refugee Agency and partners along with the US government. But the US doesn't just trust the UN Refugee Agency. Once they're handpicked, they go through extensive background and interviews with US personnel, including people from the Department of Homeland Security who go out there and are trained to cross-examine people. And a number of different people do these interviews to make sure that these people are who they say they are. Again.
Okay, it's that story is not understood in the public at large. I just have to tell you, there is a fear factor that's out there.
Absolutely.
That's widely shared.
Yeah.
And it comes out of Orlando now. Because there are imams there who've been preaching, go after gays. Mm-hmm. That's where you'll find pieces in heaven. And it's been very disturbing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's no sense that there are better controls and there are more checks, and they're actually the refugee organizations are much more engaged in deciding who.
Yeah.
That's not understood at all.
It's not, and I think that's why, in addition to what we talked about, a kind of global change of frame and response, we have to think about this from a media perspective as well.
Yep.
This is why the company Show of Force and what they're doing with Humanity on the Move is so important. They want to bring not just to the US, but to countries around the world, the face of refugees, so we can see that these people are not a danger to us. They are actually assets to us. I mean, we have, again, a number of people here in the audience, and I hope all of you will interact with some of our friends who came here tonight, who are US citizens who've come here through our refugee program and have contributed in immense ways.
Let me if I can't see very well, but if the lights can change a little bit, it'd be easier to see. But I want to invite questions from the floor. We have around 10 minutes. And does anyone want to pose a question? This is a unique opportunity to talk to Sasha. Who would like to follow up here? Yes, please. Yes, sir.
What obligation, if any, do the leaders of the free world have in trying to stabilize these areas that are, exportating all these refugees?
So
It's a loaded question.
No, it's a good question. Maybe I'll just repeat it because you're not Mike, but what obligation do the leaders of the free world have to actually trying to bring an end to the crises of our time? I think it's a great question, and the fact is that these are political crises, and a humanitarian development response is not going to change that. We have to come together politically to try to figure out how to address these crises. The US is working on that with a number of leading partners and governments around the world, but we have seen that even this kind of political response does not quickly bring an end to crises.
If anything, aren't we moving backward from sort of nation building, as it's called, which is now a much maligned, concept that if you get involved with trying to build nations, you're going to waste a lot of money, and it's only going to come back in your face, and you look like we've been trying to rebuild Iraq, and it's more of a mess now than it was when we started. How do we? I sense that people are stepping back from. We're retreating from a sense of we, the United States, should be the moral leaders in trying to solve these problems and bringing alliances, bringing the UN. If anything, even though we've got a terrific person representing us at the UN, we don't, and Samantha Power, we don't have the kind of full embrace. When the Millennial Goals, the Millennial Goals did far better than anybody expected, especially in cutting the rate of poverty, extreme poverty, in half. And they got almost no credit here in the United States.
Yeah, certainly. No, David, I'm sorry. I'm also thinking about your role, and I'm changing the topic slightly, but your role
Sure.
because I don't want to actually miss this point.
Okay.
But your role in supporting social entrepreneurship. You've been somebody who supported entrepreneurship at the Global Economic Forum and in other ways, and we're seeing that social entrepreneurs, as they're called, don't necessarily start individual organizations that can go on to address the crises of our time. And you and I were just at Harvard talking about this term,
systems change.
Systems entrepreneurs.
Yep.
Could we touch on that briefly?
Sure,
because
please.
I think actually it relates to nation building, I think, in the sense that while we may be taking a step back, we do see that from a development and perspective, we are engaged. Maybe not from a political perspective, from a development perspective. So when we think about organizations that can play a role in that, what is this term systems entrepreneur, and why is it important?
Well, there's a growing recognition that now among young people, and we are blessed in this country with a lot of idealists in the younger generation, some of your sons and daughters, who really want to change things. They find the structure of power in this country unacceptable and how we're responding, but they're also interested in the international. And instead of going into government, many are now going to nonprofits. And increasingly they call themselves social entrepreneurs. They're trying to be entrepreneurial about changing society. And they often work for nonprofits. Some of these are for-profits. They take all their money and pour it back into the cause, so that they, the Grameen Bank, for example, is self-supporting. But it's also made a major difference in the lives of millions of women who have taken advantage of that and other similar banks. And so here's the problem, or the challenge, that these social entrepreneurs are extraordinarily well-meaning people. They're some of the most admirable people. Sasha, a good example. They go off and they start an organization. They work like the Dickens, and they do make striking progress, but the problems are so much bigger than the progress they can make as individual organizations. Take an organization called 1 Acre. It works in Africa. It's a very well-run social entrepreneurship program, and they try to make farmers more self-sufficient in Africa and then actually be able to produce their own produce that they can sell. So that they become not only more self-sufficient in terms of their food, but also they can then support their families. And they've made absolutely remarkable progress for a nonprofit. They've now served 3 million farmers in Africa. That's a large number. So I met with the head of the 1 Acre and I said, tell me about the population that you would like to serve. How big is the problem? They've now reached, after a lot of effort, they've reached 3 million people. He said, the challenge is we have 50 million who need us. And so the issue for a lot of social entrepreneurs is, how do you really move the needle? You go out there and you work 10, 20 years, and yet you can't show very much progress. Look at the efforts that have been made. All the social entrepreneurs have been involved in public education reform in this country. There have been some wonderful things, some wonderful charter schools right here in New York City. And yet the progress we've made in education as a whole has been limited. And so what the conversation is now moving to is, how do you actually not change just within one organization, change the problem, you help a limited number of people, as Sasha has done. How do you actually change the system so that embedded within the system, there are ways to begin changing the whole overall? How do we move from 60 million refugees in the world to 40 million? How do we set a goal and actually start doing things that reduce that number? It would make a huge difference in the quality of life, on the planet, if we could begin having systems change. So Sasha just came to a conference at the Kennedy School at our Center on Leadership, helped to co-sponsor, to talk with other social entrepreneurs about how do we engage in system change? How do we figure this out? And what you find is that it requires an extraordinary amount of collaboration across nonprofits so that they're not just out competing with each other for somebody's dollars, which is what often happens today. One nonprofit has to go out and out-hustle the other nonprofit trying to get the same hedge fund person to give them money. How do you start collaborating across, and how do you start collaborating with governments and with corporations and with philanthropists so that you bring a large group of people who are working in a collaborative way? And there's no better example than on malaria. And there was a concerted, orchestrated way to tackle malaria, mostly in Africa, but in other developing countries. And Ray Chambers, who was a major philanthropist and a business guy, worked with a lot of NGOs and with governments, and many of them national governments. And we've made enormous progress on malaria. We've made enormous progress on polio around the world. It used to be in 25 countries as a scourge. We're down to 2 countries. There's a very good piece in the new issue of Foreign Affairs, the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, and it's the case for global optimism. Case for global optimism. It's written by, of all people, Larry Summers, and a fellow who's the dean of the Public Policy School in Singapore, Kishore Madhavani. And it's a really interesting piece about the way that, in fact, in some instances, there have been these collaborations. There's an old saying that for nonprofit NGO founders, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And that's the spirit of trying to get systems changed.
Yeah, and I think one of the keys to this concept of systems change is the idea of altruism.
Yep.
Because I think altruism, when we think of not just supporting others, but the selfless support of others, it's subjugating your own organization and your own needs to the benefit of the larger goal. That's actually exactly what Refuge Point tries to do. We have very consistently supported other organizations, highlighted them, tried to bring governments and UN agencies and NGOs and philanthropists together to address these problems collectively.
This is why he's very special. not only has the moral center, but he's actually trying to figure out, not how do I promote Sasha, how do we actually move the world and move the needle? We're going to only be here for a few more minutes. Additional question? Yes, yeah, please, here, and then we're going to go there. Please, sir, yes, you, yeah.
So you spoke about crucible.
Could you stand up so everybody can hear you?
Sure, yeah. So you spoke about crucible moments, and in the video it mentioned you being worried that helping the additional 32 might jeopardize the original 112. And one of the important parts of finding your moral decision is challenging yourself, either it comes from within or someone else. But I'm just curious about how hindsight is 2020, and the situation ended up working out,
Absolutely.
and it was a great decision. But considering that the moral decision that you made potentially could have jeopardized other people,
Yep.
how do you justify that when you're trying to make these crucible decisions?
It's a great question, and we could have easily not gotten anybody out, and those people could have lost their lives there. When I asked myself that, I thought, can I live with myself if we don't try? And Sheikha helped to bring that out. Can we live with ourselves if we don't try? That's kind of the question that confronted me and that I had to answer for myself. Can I live with myself if I don't try?
Good response. Go ahead.
I saw my brother raising his hand over
Oh,
there.
good. Okay, your brother.
Oli.
I wanted to ask a question about the book. I think it's really compelling idea at the center of the book.
Could you speak up, please?
Yeah.
The idea at the center of the book.
The Chanoffs are not soft-spoken, please.
The idea at the center of the book of leaders all having gone through some kind of crucible moment is, and establishing their moral compass at that moment is really compelling. And I'm wondering, since most of us aren't leaders, it's by definition a rare thing, right? Somebody who can impact a lot of people. Most of us aren't faced in our lives with some extreme dramatic moment, or aren't necessarily, where we have to make a decision that's, we have to find a rock bottom kind of morals. And so I'm wondering if you think that the book has value for people who aren't leaders, outside the sphere of this scholarship or leadership. Is there something for regular people who live regular lives in this book?
David, is there something for regular people in their regular lives in this book rather than just for leaders, these kind of crucible situations?
Yes, I think that the critical point of this, although you ought to come back and complete this answer, is that what you often find in life is that people are leading what appear to be ordinary lives. At some moment are called upon to make a decision or to take an act, to do an act that this often happens to soldiers, but it happens in civilian life as well, in which you've got to step forward. And you discover things inside yourself that you never knew were there. So we shouldn't say, well, they're ordinary people and then they're leaders. Harry Truman, very famously, had been he was the only president in the 20th century who never went to college. When he came out of high school, his family was too poor. It hit hard times, and he had to go work on a family farm for 7 years, mostly behind a mule. But he became extremely well educated. He's a self-educated man. And anyway, when World War I came along, he had to go fake his way in because he had terrible eyesight, and he sort of essentially lied and got in. But he had these glasses. David McCullough said his glasses were like the old bottoms of old Coca-Cola bottles. I don't know if some of you may recall those. They were really thick. And Truman was with his troops in France up in the mountains when they were shelled by Germans late at night in a great storm. And everybody was frightened because the shells were falling on them. They thought they were being gassed, and they all started to scatter. Truman got on his horse, and the horse fell over. Truman lost his glasses. He was in terrible shape. And then he got up. He'd never done this before. He'd never seen himself. He thought he was just an ordinary guy, off a farm. And he started yelling at his troops to get back. And he called them the filthiest names imaginable. But he got his troops back into the camp and they lived through the night, and he brought them home safely, and he became their hero. And in that moment, that was his crucible moment, as David McCullough described it, his crucible moment. And Truman discovered that he had a courage in him he did not know he had, and that he had the capacity for leadership that he did not know he had. So I don't accept this notion that there are special people who are leaders and are the rest of us. Rather, I think that there is a leadership quality in almost everyone, and those moments will come when you have to step up. It could be within your family. It could be in a small setting. It could be within a relationship, but it could be something you're serving society. It could be in your synagogue. It could be other places where you find you need to step up. You have the last word. Literally the last word.
I think that you should come with me to talk about the book more. But, my dad called me when we were writing the book, and he said, I found something that I think highlights this entire book, and it was a quote from the sociologist James Q. Wilson. And that quote is that the moral sense is not a strong beacon light. It is rather a small candle flame, flickering and sputtering in the strong winds of power and passion, greed and ideology. But brought close to the heart and cupped in one's hands, it dispels the darkness and warms the soul. And I think this book is about finding your moral center and enabling you to connect with who we are at our core as human beings, and then using that understanding to influence our actions and our lives.
Sasha, thank you for your moral leadership.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Right here.